Non desespero, me denolo sulupo.
Hello, I'm Edith Hall. I'm Professor of Classics at Durham University. I'm a wife and a mother. I've raised 3 daughters, one of them a stepdaughter, and I'm an extremely happy woman of 65. I'm going to tell you a little bit about how I got into classics and what it's meant to me, and how I've tried, I hope successfully, to change the subject just a little bit for the better. So I first got introduced to classics because my father was a priest in the Church of England, and I was very curious about the funny Greek lettering in the many copies of the New Testament in Greek that were lying around the house. And actually, my father helped me when I was about 8 to construe my first ever sentence in ancient Greek, which was the first sentence of the Gospel according to St. John, en arche and hologos, in beginning, no definite article was the word. And I got a cat, my first cat, about that stage. And my father explained to me that the ancient Greek for cat was ailoros, twisty tail, and we called my cat Ailora. But just as important to me as the ancient Greek was the famous movie Jason and the Argonauts, which was made when I was only 2 or 3 years old, with its unbelievable special effects by Ray Harryhausen. I can still remember the thrilling moment with Talos, the bronze robot of Crete, got his comeuppance with the help of Medea's magic. And when I was an early teenager, my school took me to see the Cambridge Greek play, and it was Euripides' Medea, and this extraordinarily glamorous woman called Mary Margaret McCabe was playing Medea in a most fantastic, slightly oriental-looking frock. I thought she was the coolest thing I had ever seen, and I really wanted to be her and tried to become her. But I was extraordinarily fortunate because I was one of the very last generation of people who got a scholarship to a grammar school on the old direct grant system. If I'd been in the state system, the state secondary school hadn't got a scholarship to that school. 60% of the girls at Nottingham Girls' High School were actually on scholarships. I would never, ever have been offered ancient Greek. I didn't much take to Latin at that time. That was only because we were just forced to read Caesar on his own barbaric military operations. It was only later, when I was at university, that I actually fell in love with Virgil, as so many of us have. And of course, for me, it was actually Silver Latin. I loved Seneca and Lucan, a sort of Baroque aesthetic Latin. So I went off to Oxford. It was kind of expected of me from Nottingham Girls' High School. Did the entrance exam, got in, took a year out, worked as a waitress in Switzerland, and learnt some very peculiar German, which has actually stood me in very good stead for reading about things like Greek meter and textual criticism. Went to Oxford, did enjoy the work, but felt curiously alienated because I couldn't match the academic writing and reading I was doing with my then very fast growing commitment to the cause of the poor, basically, to left-wing politics. I couldn't make sense of it. I didn't see how the sort of essays I was writing and the sort of skills I was learning matched up in any way with what I wanted to do with my life. Not that I really knew what I wanted to do with my life, but it really wasn't just textual criticism of Sophocles. So I sort of went off for a couple of years and got a bit lost, really. I tried working in a shipping company. I spoke some modern Greek and got a job with a shipping company, thought it might be useful, but got very upset when discovering just how badly treated some of the working class people were in this shipping company. I was set to work to run tugboat companies, which Corey Ship Towing belonged to this big company. And I was always supposed to be sort of oppressing the tugboat workers, but they were always right. They were doing things like simply ask for earmuffs to protect their ears from the engine noise. And I moved ever further to the left, and it became increasingly obvious that I couldn't possibly work for a commercial enterprise of that nature. I left took a year off and worked actually for the miners during the Great Miners' Strike of 1984 to 5. Really became quite a little class warrior, and had a really amazing meeting with an old socialist friend of mine, sadly not been with us for a long time, called Margot Heinemann. Now, she was a lecturer in English at New Hall and at Goldsmiths in London. And she said to me, "What are we going to do with you, Edith? Right? You seem never so miserable. You're always crying. So you can't go into politics because you've got to be Teflon. You're not actually working class yourself. So you really can't go in and around and sort of lead a union or something. But you've got a brain," she said. "Here you are, sitting on an excellent degree. You can get a grant, which you could automatically get a doctoral grant if you've got a first class degree. Go and do a doctorate." And I said, "Well, I don't get how to match up my subject with politics." And she says, "Well, you've got a brain, figure it out." So I did. I thought, right, what am I most passionate about right now? And it was racism. This was the mid-1980s. Nelson Mandela was still in prison. I was often outside the South African embassy. So I decided I was going to do ethnic stereotypes in Greek literature. How did the ancient Greeks construct their negative images of people who weren't Greek? And I was able then to sort of match up for the first time my politics, what I wanted to do, allowed me to read an awful lot about ethnicity and constructions of ethnicity and the way it's actually all related to self-definition. People produce negative stereotypes of how they define their own country. And that ended up as my first book, Inventing the Barbarian, Greek Self-Definition Through Tragedy. So at that point, I decided that Margot was right. I actually wrote down a list. I remember of all the things I thought was actually sort of not quite right or room for improvement in the way classics was taught, delivered and studied, and made a life plan. I decided to tick them off. I said I was going to do something about gender. I was going to do something about develop the ethnicity and do a lot, I hoped, on social class. But in all of these particular arenas where I have published a lot and run some quite major research projects and tried to change the way the subject is taught, introduce much more interesting thematic courses, especially at universities I've taught at, on slavery or images of women, that kind of thing. But I was helped all along because I'd already discovered Aristotle's ethics, which are a very positive thing, virtue ethics, which sounds poncy, but actually it's just about trying to be a good person on the premise that if you try to be a good person, you will be happier. And I really believe it works. So I eventually published a book called Aristotle's Way, trying to show how you could apply Aristotle's ethics to an ordinary woman's life in the 21st century and how helpful it could be. So what I would say is, I would advise people to develop an overall plan, a sort of purpose, what you get up for in the morning. And that is what has motivated me and got me up in the morning, is let's go and try and change this subject a little bit more. But within that, I realised, thinking about what I was going to say today, just how responsive a mode it has been for me. So many things. I might have known in principle I wanted to do something about, say, women. I introduced courses on images of women at both Durham and Royal Holloway, worked on them also at my first job at the University of Reading. But it was a particular PhD student, Rosie Wiles, who is now, again, my colleague at Durham. And she was extremely interested in a couple of female classical scholars in France in the 17th and early 18th centuries, in particular the amazing Madame Anne Dacier, who was the first woman to translate all of Homer into French from ancient Greek. And she and I, Rosie, immediately decided we were going to do a book, which ended up as Women Classical Scholars, came out in 2016. We've tried to build a history of four mothers, of smiling, beautiful lady faces, famous women academics. The latest was Jacqueline de Romilly, who was born in 1913. And we're very proud of that. So we've got a gallery of famous women to hang, like all those rather stern-looking gentleman on the walls of Oxbridge and London colleges. The responsive mode was also very much to do with, guess what, classical civilization and ancient history qualifications. So that these days is a major national campaign. ACE, Advocating Classics Education, which I co-run with Professor Arlene Holmes Henderson. But I first got interested in that because when I was a PhD, or as Oxford they call it, DPhil student, I started teaching classical civilization at local, what they rudely call crammers, A-level colleges. And I had never known about classical civilization. For all the classics I'd done in my Oxford degree, I had never, ever understood that there was this other world where you approached ancient Greece and Rome sort of societally through a variety of different sources, de-emphasizing the actual language learning so that you could actually absorb far more because you had all this time released about the culture, about the architecture, about the social background. And this was a revelation to me. This was in about 1985, and it fed directly into my own doctoral research. When people say, "Oh, Edith's work is good because she puts literature against its cultural, historical, and material background," I learned that from teaching A-level classical civilization. And I remember my first student, he was called Lars, he was from Denmark, and he got an alpha, an A, and I was prouder of that even than of my own degree. So the classical civilization ran in tandem, has done all throughout my working life. I've always tried to get the universities I've been working at to take it seriously as an A-level, to embrace students who'd not have the opportunity to do Latin and Greek outside before they came to university, as 93% of our kids really don't. There's so little Latin and Greek sadly taught in the state system now. And I've worked on that, but it was meeting Arlene. This is where the responsive mode comes in. It was meeting Arlene in about 2014 that made me realise here was a like-minded person with complementary skills. And suddenly I felt we could do it because I got someone to do it with. That had happened also over founding the Archive of Performances of Greek and Roman Drama in Oxford in 1996. Actually, that was born when I met Fiona McIntosh, who's just about to retire as the director of the archive. Guess where we met? We were doing our PhDs. We met on one of the very first classical civilization summer camps. And that was at a school in Oxfordshire. We met and we realised we shared a passion for the history of performing Greek and Roman drama. I actually was a failed opera singer. I trained a bit to sing. I'd love to have been a performer. Second best thing was to write about musical theatre, which is exactly what ancient Greek tragedy and comedy are. But it was meeting Fiona. We designed this plan. And when I arrived at Oxford, I said to Oliver Taplin, I'm going to apply for some money. We're going to set this thing up. Showed him the design. He said, yeah. And he had a huge collection of stuffy programmes and posters and lots of experience working at the National Theatre alongside Tony Harrison on the Eurostar. So that was a perfect partnership. And that resulted, of course, in many volumes, including with Fiona, the book on Greek tragedy and performance on the British stage since the Restoration. So this responsive mode is incredibly important. One thing I would really recommend, and of course, COVID has really hampered this, but get out there, talk to as many people as possible, talk to them about everything, find out about what really makes them tick, because almost all the people I co-work with and I collaborate constantly, I have found out about their passion, not through formal academic interchanges, but by those conversations in the ladies' loo or in the bar or, on the bus. It's really, really important. And then you discover that you've got commonalities and you can produce lots more work and build things and found initiatives. The responsive mode, Emma Bridges was my PhD student at Durham. It was her who said, I want to do a conference on how the Persian Wars have been seen in more modern culture. So we did. And with Peter Rhodes, we produced cultural responses to the Persian Wars. because of my politics and actually the sort of childhood fascination as a Cold War baby, was with the Eastern Bloc. I'd long corresponded with scholars, even before the Berlin Wall came down, in various former Soviet bloc countries, especially Ukraine, Bulgaria, East Germany. And it's through them that I was able to decide I wanted to write two books all about the Black Sea Greeks. One was Adventures with Iphigenia and Taurus, because Iphigenia and Euripides' play, Iphigenia and Taurus, is actually in Sevastopol in Crimea. So I was able to get a trip out there, and with the amazing Black Sea archaeologist David Braund, and that led to two books, one the Iphigenia and Taurus book, and the other the book about Black Sea performance culture, because I really got frustrated with how classicists always talked about the Mediterranean world, when in fact the ancient Greeks and Romans were all around the Black Sea as well. It was an extraordinarily important part of their culture, their economy and their politics. So I hope I've shifted people's perspective slightly on that. With class, of course, now class, I'm completely bourgeois. No claims to anything else. But my father was raised in a working class family in the East End. His father was actually a Metropolitan Police Constable. He was never promoted. And then he was a night security man and a warehouse in the working class new town of Stevenage. And I did have a very strong sense from visiting all my father's many, many, many relatives of the worth and beauty of spirit of these people. And that certainly has made me feel a little bit hybrid in terms of class. And I long ago, 30 years ago, started collecting evidence of people who'd come from working class backgrounds or were working class, who over the centuries have one way or another got access to classics as autodidacts through workers' libraries. And that book I'm probably more proud of than any, The People's History of Classics of 2020, was the final result of that. But I don't think I'd ever have finished that if I hadn't met the extraordinary Dr. Henry Stead, with whom I co-wrote it, because I was aware I wasn't particularly good on translations of Victorian translations of Latin poets, other than the epic poets, the love poets. And Henry just walked into my life and said, I'll do that. And we did it together. And I'm incredibly proud of it. And he's now doing great things with working class studies in classics in Scotland. So always responsive. I never really understood Clytemnestra in Aeschylus's Agamemnon until I birthed my first daughter. And all of a sudden, I looked at my husband, with whom I'd made this beautiful, beautiful little girl, and I thought, if he killed her and I had no recourse to law, what would I do? And that made me actually rather obsessively go back and read all the Greek tragedies about Clytemnestra and her children. And I've just finished, it'll be coming out in the end of October this year, 2024, my Arison Phillips edition of Aeschylus's Agamemnon, which is infused with feminist theory and all the amazing work that's come out since the great early studies of Greek tragedy from a feminist angle by my friends Froma Zeitlin and Helena Foley. I'm hoping that it's a very different account of that play from all the other editions, all except one of which are, of course, by men. So motherhood has really changed the way I do classics. That's also made me, now my children are in their early 20s, very, very aware of how precarious and miserable and difficult life can feel for young adults, far worse than for the boomer generation like me, who got their grants paid and their fees paid and their scholarships and their money for their doctorates. So I feel very profoundly committed to trying to help people of that generation. ACE really comes into that. But my very last book, which I'm just doing the proofs now, it'll be out in the spring 2025, is Green. It's an ecological reading of the Iliad, trying to show how it celebrates, to a really toxic extent, overconsumption of timber, of natural resources. It's all about deforestation. It's about how war demands the production of endless amounts of metal just to kill people, to invade more countries, to cut down more trees, to fuel the smithies that make more weapons, that make more expansion inevitable. It's passionate, it's from the heart. I've dedicated it to my children and the rest of Generation Z, with apologies for the state of the planet. And I'm delighted to bring this back around to the Classical Association, that Yale University Press didn't like the title as I suggested. I thought Achilles in Green was quite cool. Couldn't think of a title, so I just asked on social media for title, and this brilliant one, Epic of the Earth, came through. Guess whose suggestion that was? It was Katrina Kelly's, which makes me absolutely thrilled that the UK Classical Association, one of its senior workers and figureheads, has left her big mark on that book. So that makes it feel even more like a joint and cooperative exercise than it would have done otherwise. So my tip, plan your life, get a purpose, think what really matters to you, but then act responsively and go out and just simply talk to as many people as you can, and you will meet the allies. We are stronger together. We're stronger working in pairs and groups. And that is, of course, exactly what the Classical Association is. Thank you very much.
Nosons esfenu medenolo sulupu Rossoli honesti